In this lecture, I wish to deal with the imperial cult, or the Roman imperial cult. And this was established by the Emperor Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and he essentially set up an institution for the veneration of the emperor's spirit, or genius, where we get the word genius. And then upon the emperor's death, if he had been a pious and good emperor, he would join the gods, and there would be a formal ritual of consecratio and a vote of the Roman Senate that the emperor had actually joined the gods, that his genius had become what is called in Latin a divus in Latin, divus as we anglicize it, divi in the plural, diva is the singular for the feminine. That meant the emperor, in effect, his spirit became a god and is on Mount Olympus with the various gods of Greece and Rome. It was a new institution in many ways, but it drew on many, many older practices in the Mediterranean world and the Near East on the veneration of rulers. These practices go back quite early, but there was a decisive change in the time of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great essentially established the Hellenized version of ruler cults in the 4th century BC. In 324 BC, he was proclaimed essentially not a god, but someone who would join the gods by virtue of his great deeds. And in the case of Alex, he was an ancestor of Achilles and Heracles, the Roman Hercules, so his deeds were to be compared to these heroes of old. And in the case of Heracles, Heracles himself had an apotheosis, which is the Greek word for joining the gods. That is, Heracles in myth arrived at Mount Olympus and was worshipped as a god in Alex's own time and later. This notion of venerating the ruler, who could then, upon his death or her death, because it could extend to queens and empresses just as much, is a tradition that was widespread in the eastern half of the Roman Empire when the Romans in the Republic during the 2nd and 1st century BC conquered these regions. Macedonian kings, that is, families descended from the generals of Alexander the Great, ruled as monarchs in these regions. In Egypt, there were the Ptolemies. In the Asian possessions, the Seleucids, descendants of Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals. Ptolemy, the family in Egypt, was descended from one of Alexander's generals as well. And in northwestern Turkey today, at the city of Pergamon, were the Attalid kings, who were rather newcomers, parvenus to the royal families. All of them had ruler cults. All of them projected themselves with the titles and the attributes of a divinity. And the understanding was that they, too, could undergo an apotheosis upon their deaths. In Asia Minor in particular, there was a long-established tradition of ruler cults. These can be seen through a succession of archaeological monuments that tourists may or may not see. Some of them are a bit remote, but they start in the 13th century BC with Hittite kings at C.I.A, and it runs through the great tumuli, or burials of the kings of Lydia and Phrygia, the great tombs at Amasya to the Pontic kings, climaxes in the sanctuary of Nemrut Da, which is just to the west of the Euphrates, where a tumulus was built on top of a mountain, which is something like 6,000 or 7,000 feet above sea level, for a minor king of the kingdom of Commagene, and then huge platforms were built on the east and west end of down below from the tumulus to receive the sunrise and the sunset, with colossal statues of the king and the various gods. In Egypt, there was an extremely well-established tradition, at least from the 3rd dynasty on, that the pharaoh was a living god and would become the god Osiris in death. All of these traditions had been accommodated by the Greeks in what we call the Hellenistic age, that is the time from the death of Alexander the Great to the final Roman conquest in 31 BC. And for the Greeks, it was a way of accommodating the fact that they lived in city-states based on the rule of law. These were republics or democracies, and they had to accommodate the fact that their overlord was some Macedonian or Iranian dynast. And the way to do that was, in effect, to venerate that ruler as, if not a god, close to a god, and then you could justify the fact that the god king had special privileges and rights, and in turn, the monarch would respect the autonomy and freedom of the Greek city. So there was both a political and religious dimension to these ruler cults. The Roman ruler cult, established by Augustus, was based on the veneration of Julius Caesar, the adoptive father of Octavian, who became the Roman Emperor Augustus in 27 BC. Caesar, who was popular with the crowds, was believed shortly after his death to be taken up to join the gods when a comet was seen at the time of the Latin Games in the summer of 44 BC. Already Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, claimed that his father had joined the gods and was Deus. And Octavian took as one of his titles, Filius Divi, son of a deified one, son of a god. Now, the deification was not formalized until a decree of the Senate on January 1st in 42 BC. And from that date, many scholars would start the inception of ruler worship in the Roman world. There had been always honors paid to great Romans, but Rome was a republic. And the Romans detested monarchy, and the Roman upper classes detested anything that smacked of emperor worship or rulers, and Roman emperors had to project themselves as essentially magistrates of the republic for the benefit of the aristocracy in Rome. But for the rest of the Roman world, for the numerous provinces and nations that made up the Roman Empire, especially in the eastern half of the Roman world and in Egypt, even in sections of the western provinces, ruler worship made sense to these people. The emperor was their patron. He was, in all intents and purposes, effectively a god in many ways. He operated, and so the imperial cult, as developed by Augustus, the previous revolutionary known as Octavian, was very, very much pitched to the provinces and far less pitched to Italy and Rome, where there was an aversion to all of this. Furthermore, this was not outright adulation of the emperor as a god. Invariably, the emperor's spirit was worshipped in tandem with other gods, usually the goddess Roma. There was a tradition going back into the 2nd century BC of many provincial cities in Asia Minor, in Spain particularly. We have a number of documented cases where temples were set up to Roma. The goddess Roma, which represents the city of Rome, was then added to that particular provincial city among their divinities. So in the case of Augustus, his genius was usually linked with the veneration of Roma, and again, it was his spirit. It was the potential god of Augustus that was worshipped and not the living god. The first example we have of this comes from a record of Pergamon in 25 BC, where Augustus approved the erection of a temple, both to Roma and to the genius of Augustus. It was approved by petition of the local elites who wanted to set up this temple. Augustus was very careful in supervising and making sure that the provincials understood this was not the veneration of a living god, but of his spirit, plus the goddess Roma was to be associated in the temple. And that temple is still to be located in the city of Pergamon, but it's celebrated in literary sources, coins, and inscriptions, so we know about it. From that point on, the honors were paid along these lines in provincial cities. That is, provinces and cities set up these types of temples. Furthermore, the ceremony of consecration, or consecratio in Latin, was very carefully described and elaborated over the course of the 1st century and became a very, very specific and formal religious ceremony. We have reliefs of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in which the emperor is depicted as being carried off to Mount Olympus or to the gods on an eagle, which is the bird of Jupiter Zeus. And it was purported at a funeral pyre when the emperor was deified, his body was burned, he was deified when an eagle appeared and took you up to the heavens. In the case of empresses, it would be a peacock, who was the bird of Juno, Juno the counterpart of Jupiter. Both members of the imperial family, the emperor and the empress and their children, were all potentially deified. Many of the monuments built in Rome in the imperial age always have this sort of religious dimension to them. The great column of Trajan, that everyone goes to see the reliefs of the Dacian War. Beneath the column itself were deposited the ashes of the emperor after he had died, and his body was cremated in the Forum, and of course an eagle was seen. Trajan, Optimus Principus, one of the best of emperors, was obviously carried up to the gods. And so the memorial not only celebrates his achievements, but it also marks the fact that those achievements entitled Trajan to join the gods. And that's a point that's often missed when you're wandering around Rome and you see this impressive monument. Emperors took pains to deify their predecessors. In a couple of cases, these were rather overt political acts. In 195 AD, Septimius Severus rehabilitated the reputation of the Emperor Commodus, who was the rather crazy son of Marcus Aurelius. He's the emperor in the recent movie Gladiator, or maybe not so recent, and Commodus was condemned as an evil emperor, but Septimius Severus, who won the throne by a civil war, had himself retroactively adopted by Marcus Aurelius, and that meant Commodus was now his brother, so Commodus had to be rehabilitated and made a Deus. The Emperor Macrinus, who ordered the assassination of his predecessor Caracalla, promptly had Caracalla deified. That also threw suspicion off his involvement in the plot. In the mid-3rd century, we'll be talking about an Emperor Trajan Decius, who ordered the first empire-wide persecutions. He too was an emperor who came to the throne by civil war. He had no particular qualifications. He struck coins celebrating all the deified emperors going back to Augustus as a way of stressing his legitimacy. And this is an extremely important point to make about the imperial cult. You want to set yourself up as within the line of deified and recognized emperors who have joined the gods. And that's a way to give legitimacy to yourself. And that was solemnized by formal swearing of oaths, a sacramentum, where we get the word sacrament, by army and provincials, to the imperial imago, where we get the word image. So this institution had been set up by Augustus and is elaborated over the course of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. On the other hand, to carry out this type of institution, the emperor had a minimal bureaucracy. The Roman Empire was run on very, very few officials. Most of the senior officials were members of the senatorial aristocracy who served out of loyalty to Rome rather than to any kind of loyalty to the emperor. It was still in many ways supposed to be republican trappings. True, it was a constitutional fiction, but it was an important one. In order to make the imperial cult go, the emperor had to depend on the local elites. Again, those decuriones or decurions. That is the civic ruling classes. In a large city like Athens or Ephesus, they could be 500 members on the town council. In a lesser city, they might be 100 or 50. But they represented the families that had the property, the wealth, the social prestige, the influence, the Latin word would be auctoritas, to make things go. And in this case, the imperial cult rested very much on local initiative. In fact, without local initiative, there probably would be no imperial cult. And that fact alone vitiates arguments that this was set up by the imperial government as some kind of PR, propaganda, comparing it to totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. These are all very, very misleading. The initiative really came from below. I mentioned earlier, it was the leading citizens of Pergamon who first petitioned Augustus, we want a temple to you. And he said, yeah, you get a temple to my genius, and by the way, you add Roma. But the initiative came from below. There are several dramatic examples that illustrate this that have come to us through the archaeology. One, again, is the city of Ephesus. When you go to Ephesus today, you usually start at the east end, the so-called Magnesia Gate, the same gate through which the procession of the statue came through. You start at a public forum, or agora, which is essentially a Roman political center. There are temples to Augustus. There's a temple to Domitian, celebrating his victories over the Germans off on the distant Rhine, which had a colossal statue, which is now in the Ephesus Museum, which is the ugliest statue of Domitian I've ever seen. Marginally improved by the later Christians who put a cross on him. For some reason, he was retroactively baptized. There's a temple to Hadrian. There's a fountain of Trajan. As you go down the main street to the harbor, you have all of these imperial cult temples that made the city of Ephesus a showplace not only for civic institutions and the traditional gods, but also for the emperor. At Pergamon, People go up to see the great Adalid Citadel. That's the citadel of the 3rd and 2nd century BC, but you can only really appreciate it when you're down below, when you're looking up above, and you see these incredible vaults that extended the citadel to build a temple to the Emperor Trajan and Roma, which in effect turned the Hellenistic citadel into a Roman center, with the Temple of Trajan just audaciously on top of these vaults, this white marble Baroque-style temple dominating the citadel, and everywhere you stand in Lower Pergamon, where the modern Turkish city is, you could still see the ruins. You couldn't miss it. Pisidian Antioch I talked about, a Roman colony set in Western Asia Minor in the mountain landscape, which for the Roman colonists would have been very, very similar to Umbria, Tuscany. It's a beautiful area. They built a Roman civic downtown, and the showpiece at the end of a succession of squares is an elevated temple to Augustus made out of the rock that was excavated there. It's a sort of tuff is the proper pronunciation. That is a volcanic rock which is built up, faced with marble and brick, and dominates the whole public area. You stand up there, you have a shot all the way down to the entrance into the public regions. This is a common way of celebrating the emperor across the empire. I've drawn examples from Asia Minor, but you will find them in all provinces, imperial temples. A more common way, which is less easy to document, is that many times an existing temple became sunaos in Greek. That is, cult statues of the imperial family were put into the existing temple. This was dramatically illustrated either in 1998 or 99. My memory is a little defective, but it's one of those 2 years when I visited Sardis, a city in Asia Minor, well known as the city of the Lydian kings, and colossal statues had been dug up. These colossal statues had apparently been given burial in the 4th or 5th century AD. They were part of, they're the heads, only the heads. The statue elements have broken up. And they represent 5 colossal statues, which are Antoninus Pius and his wife, Faustina the Elder, Marcus Aurelius and his wife, Faustina the Younger, and again, the Emperor Commodus. Commodus was apparently placed in the Temple of Artemis, found on the east end, and brought up in a trial trench, totally unexpected, cleaned off by a very, very well-known conservator, a fellow named Kent Severson. And I arrived there when he was cleaning them up. And what they are is a case of sunaos. That is, the imperial cult statues were put in one of the major temples of the city, and so they shared the sacred space with the city god, or in this case, goddess. And this was, again, common across the empire. We have lots of references to it. So decuriones, or decurions, advanced their rank by all of these efforts to set up imperial cult temples, to set up processions to the imperial cult temple, and the imperial cult had processions and festivals very, very similar to other cults. We have an important inscription I'll be talking about from a benefactor called Opramois in Lycia, which is in southwestern Turkey. And one of the biggest items he talks about in giving money is to imperial cult temples to the lesser cities of Lycia. It's easy to misunderstand what this is all about. Many moderns would take a cynical view of it, and if you read the historians of the time, like Tacitus or the biographer Suetonius, or you go back into the literature of the Republic, the Roman senatorial upper class would see this stuff as just overt flattery of a despot, and they would hate it because they are nostalgically tied to the Republic. On the other hand, they represent a very, very tiny minority, and the voices of the rest of the Roman world are not articulated as well. But there are some indications that even in the literate circles, this principle was accepted. One is from the author Seneca. Lucius Annius Seneca, the tutor of the Emperor Nero, who wrote a work on clemency, which his promising student Nero never read, and he penned a work known as the Polycantosis, which is a spoof on the imperial ceremony I described. But it's not a spoof on the ceremony per se. Augustus deserved to be deified. It's a spoof on the Emperor Claudius being deified, and it's just a wickedly delicious piece in which Claudius joins the gods, but then he's carried back to the underworld because Caligula comes up and claims him, from a debt in some kind of gambling. And it's all nonsense parody. It's spoofing Claudius. Claudius really didn't deserve to be among the Divi, but it's not really mocking the institution. And this is from one of Nero's ministers, who is of the senatorial rank. Greek intellectuals long accepted and justified the apotheosis of an emperor. They compared it to Heracles in myth. And the Greeks are prone to hyperbole, but in part it's a result of the Greek language. The Greeks had a word theos, meaning God or goddess. It could be either one, as opposed to divus. Latin has deus, meaning God, which many of you may be familiar with, and divus, which is a deified one. It makes two distinctions. Greek only has one. So sometimes when the Greeks are calling the emperor theos, they're meaning it in the sense of divus, and it's easy to get confused, and that's because of the difference of the languages. But they were always prone to hyperbole because the emperor was their patron. And to get an idea of how that all fed into the veneration of the emperor, I can't resist. I want to read a little snippet of what in effect is the preface of a loyalty oath to the Emperor Caligula, the mad Emperor Caligula who ruled from 37 to 41. This inscription comes from the city of Assos on the shore of Turkey today, and let me read a selection of it because it is the preface of an oath that all members of the town council as well as the citizen body had to swear to the Emperor Caligula, and it's the type of oath expected in the imperial cult. But the preface really drives home the hyperbole of the Greeks. Decree of the Asans on the motion of the people, whereas the rule of Gaius Caesar Germanicus Augustus, that is Caligula, hoped and prayed for by all mankind has been proclaimed, and the cosmos has found unbounded joy, and every city and people has been eager for the sight of the God, theos, meaning the potential God, since the happiest age of mankind has now begun. Wait until we get a little farther on in the reign. It was decreed by the council and the Roman businessmen resident among us and the people of Assos, that would be the assembly of citizens, to appoint an embassy chosen from the foremost and most distinguished Romans and Greeks to seek an audience and congratulate him and beg him to remember the city with solicitude as he personally promised when, together with his father Germanicus, he first set foot in our city's province. At the time, Caligula was probably about 8 years old, so I'm not sure how much the emperor remembered. A lot of flattery and praise. It meets the stereotypes that most Romans had about Greeks. Nonetheless, the oath drives home the type of religious associations with which the emperor was linked. These oaths were very, very seriously taken. They were sanctified by sacrifices. If they didn't go right, the gods would punish you. They are, in effect, prayers, the way you would offer up prayers in any kind of procession or ritual to another god or goddess. That brings up another point, which is that I mentioned that the emperors themselves were very circumspect about this. Only those emperors who overtly claimed that they would be gods in their lifetime, someone like Caligula, apparently the Emperor Commodus, who had a nervous breakdown in 189 and thought he was Hercules reborn, such emperors would end up being assassinated by the Roman elites. Other emperors, as outrageous as they were, such as Nero or Domitian or Caracalla, who thought he was Alexander the Great, or Elagabalus, who thought he was the priest king of this Syrian god, none of them made overt claims of divinity. This was something that most emperors veered away from, and those sort of claims came from below. An emperor such as Trajan was extremely circumspect. In his iconography, he was always depicted as smaller than a god whenever he was shown in association with Jupiter. So that means the initiative rests with the local elites. And particularly well documented are the cities of the Eastern Roman provinces, and among them, of course, are the cities of Asia Minor. There, the imperial cult was assimilated and tied together with local cults. Whatever the primary divinity was in the city, the imperial cult was matched with it. And so there would be processions to both. Furthermore, the ambitions of the local elites were channeled toward carrying out the activities of the imperial cult. Now, why so? Well, Rome locked up the swords of all the provincials. They couldn't express civic loyalty by fighting their neighbors, so they had to be expressed in other ways. And having an imperial cult title, or an imperial title known as Neocorus, meaning temple warden, that is, you're the protector. The whole city is a protector of that temple. It's first used in Ephesus in the time of Domitian. These were all ways of expressing the greatness of your city, as well as your own greatness as a leading magistrate who's involved with the imperial cult, who's paying for the sacrifices, paying for the events that are going on. And so local elites and cities both together benefited by putting on these rituals and processions to the imperial cult, which again are held in tandem with regular religious holidays. And in many ways, the imperial cult resembled normal religion. It had sacrifices, even initiation rites or mysteries. There was a whole hierarchy of priests, the men who held these positions, and in some instances, women. Since military virtue was no longer important, it was a matter of money and rank. We have women holding high positions in the imperial cult and civic government. All of this meant that in many, many ways, the imperial cult resembled other types of worship. So it's a mistake to think that it was imposed by an imperial government, that the Emperor Augustus and associates were seated around each evening figuring out how do we win the loyalty of the provincials. We need an imperial cult. There's nothing of the sort. That meant the imperial cult was woven into the religious, social, and political fabric of cities. And this is seen in several ways. In the province of Asia, which is the western third of Turkey today, the province of 500 cities, that included some of the most urbanized areas of the Roman world. The three leading cities, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamon, disputed the title of who was the first city of Asia, he prote tes Asias. Ephesus won. And you think, well, great. So Smyrna's 2, Pergamon's 3. What's that all about? It is at the koinon, that is the religious league that is instituted to run the imperial cult. The representatives of Ephesus march first. The representatives of Smyrna second. It shows the importance of the city in the province vis-a-vis the other cities and rivals, and also the importance of the city vis-a-vis the emperor. So it was very important that Ephesus won ranked number 1. At the city of Aphrodisias, same thing. We see all sorts of inscriptions of imperial benefits put up on the theater wall and elaborate reliefs in a great imperial entrance hall combining imperial, civic, and city mythology in a series of reliefs where apparently rituals were carried out to the imperial cult and city together. And those reliefs have now been properly assembled in the Museum of Aphrodisias, and Aphrodisias's excavation team is reconstructing now the great imperial hall, which again was probably typical in most cities of the Roman world. Therefore, architecturally and in rituals across the Roman world, you find this. And not to give due to the western provinces, the most famous of these is an enormous complex that used to be at the city of Lugdunum, where the local league to the imperial cult, in Latin known as a commune, which is the equivalent of a koinon in Greek, that had a great altar and complex there. It doesn't survive, but it is depicted on the coins of the cities of Augustus that show a great altar piece where various rites were held by the elites of the 3 Gauls, the 3 provincial provinces that made up Gaul. With it went the arena, the amphitheater, the gladiatorial games. All of that popularization of that Roman sport was generally held in tandem with the imperial cult. And you must remember, an amphitheater was the largest building in a Roman city, and it's closely linked to the imperial cult. This raises a question as to the Jews and Christians. The Jews were not a problem. They were recognized in Roman law as a legitimate religion. The god Yahweh, his temple at Jerusalem, the hereditary priesthood, the sacrament, they all made sense to the Romans. And the Jews were pragmatic. They would offer up prayers on behalf of Rome and the emperor, sort of a religious loyalty oath. That was sufficient. Usually the sacrifice included 2 goats daily in the sacrifices offered at the temple. The Christians refused to participate. And the Christian refusal to participate is closely linked with their refusal to worship the gods. And as we'll see, when the Christians are questioned, they are in fact drilled, will you sacrifice to the gods? The imperial cult statue is right next to the gods. And so, in effect, the Christians are refusing both worship of the ancestral gods, worship of that potential spirit of the emperor. They can be nothing more than atheists denying the gods, and they are regarded as traitors, having denied their loyalty to Rome and to the emperor.